Welcome to the Ghostly Gallery podcast, a place where we explore the world of horror in film, television, books, and in popular culture. Well, greetings, everybody. Welcome to another show. My name is Bruce Markison, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host and executive producer, Tracy Asteria. Tracy, how are you?
I'm doing good, Bruce. I'm trying to get used to the promotion upgrade. So thank you again. How's everything with you?
Good. Things are good, going well. Always quick with the promotions on my end. Not so quick on more money. We'll have to talk about that in the near future. Well, Tracy, we're very glad to have with us a guest that I've been anticipating for a while. He comes to us highly recommended by another gentleman who has been a guest a couple of times, Dan Day. Dan is a terrific historian and blogger, also a guy that goes to the Monster Bash convention every year. And Dan gave us a recommendation for this week's guest. His name is Richard Klemensen. Richard is the founder and publisher of a terrific magazine, Little Shop of Horrors, which examines the history of British horror with a special emphasis on Hammer Films and their incredible library of horror movies. Little Shop of Horrors first published way back in 1972, and it has continued ever since. More than 50 issues have been produced. Some great reviews that have been put out by other publications. For example, Cult Movies Magazine said this about Little Shop of Horrors: "This is the most fantastic film magazine being published." And Monster Scene Magazine says flat out, "This is the greatest fanzine ever," in talking about Little Shop of Horrors. And the man who puts it together, Richard Klemensen. Richard, welcome to the Ghostly Gallery. How are you?
Oh, doing fine. Cold, dreary February in Iowa, when it's good to be retired and I don't have to go to work tomorrow.
That's right. That's right. Well, everywhere it's been a rough winter. I live in upstate New York. Tracy lives north of the border in Nova Scotia. You're out in the Midwest. Everybody getting assaulted by bad weather. So we're glad to take at least a little bit of time to forget about that if we possibly can and talk about something that we share a love for, and that is horror films. First off, Richard, I want to ask you, when did you first become interested in the genre of horror films, particularly those made in Great Britain? When did this start for you?
Well, I'm one of the older fans. I was born in 1947. I was one of the first baby boomers by about a year. A small Iowa town, Mason City, Iowa, the home of Meredith Willson of the Music Man. And we could walk down, about 24,000 people. You could walk downtown to the theaters. And I quickly fell in love with horror films, any kind, science fiction, This Island Earth, Fire Remains from Outer Space. I mean, everything, Killer Shrews. But I remember in 1961 seeing The Brides of Dracula, The Curse of the Werewolf, and later Phantom of the Opera, and Captain Plague was a night creature. I thought, well, these are pretty darn great. But we moved. My father got transferred farther south to a town called Waterloo, Iowa. And that might have cost us. There was nothing on television to see. And then I got out of high school, was going to college, trying to avoid getting my draft notice, which didn't work because eventually I got one during the Vietnam War. And I started going to the theaters. But I went to a triple feature drive-in of, Valet Guanji, Ray Harryhausen, Godzilla vs. Thing Toho, and Hammer's Dracula Has Risen from the Grave, and it knocked my socks off. I came home and bless my mother, she had brought along my Famous Monsters of Filmlands and Castle of Frankenstein magazines. I looked them up, went again the next day and watched them again. And it sort of started from there. I wrote off to Roy Ashton, the famous makeup artist at Hammer, wrote off to Christopher Lee, got a signed Christopher Lee photo back, and Roy Ashton and I became great friends. And I continued to do it while I was in the service. And for a while, I was stationed in Richmond, Virginia. And being someone south, their drive-ins got every low-rent movie that came down the pike, every cheapo, but they'd have 4 and 5, 6 Hammer films in a nightly showing. And I caught up with everything. And I had discovered fanzines to reading famous monsters, stuff like Gore Creatures and Photon and Sin Fantastique, and said, I'd like to do this.
But you mentioned having seen this doubleheader, a double feature of films, Brides of Dracula, Curse of the Werewolf, both outstanding movies from Hammer. And just to sort of set the scene here, you grew up in an era, there was no cable television. You probably had what, 3, 4, 5 channels from which to choose in terms of television. So for you, there was really no outlet for horror on TV. You had to go to the theater, right?
Exactly. There was, in Mason City, we had our local station, and we got Austin, Minnesota, which the only thing I remember about it is that professional wrestling Sundays. My grandpa used to watch it. There were no movies. It shut down at midnight. They played the American flag, and they played music, and it was done for the night. Waterloo had a little bit more. Like in '68, they got a hold of the old Universal package, like the original Frankenstein, Dracula, and that. I'd never seen those. Only pictures and Count Frankenstein. But yeah, there was no video, there's no television. You went to theaters. I remember once, not related to this, when I was in service on a Saturday, they had the double feature of Monster Zero and War of the Gargantuans. It was on a Saturday, and it was me and probably 500 little kids. They probably thought I was a pedophile. I wanted to see the Japanese monster, but finally catching up at the drive-in was the key. And even when I started Little Shoppe of Horrors, you were kind of guessing on these things or using other people's reviews, what other people said about them. I made judgments about films I'd never seen, which shows how stupid the era was. But I came home, got out in January '72, went back to college to get my totally useless degree in art and education, and started Little Shoppe of Horrors in, June of 1972. It's me and my mother.
I want to talk about that in a moment, how you got the idea to start up the magazine after you were discharged honorably from Vietnam. But you also mentioned a moment ago that you went to see a triple feature. And that's something that most of us today, we're not really familiar with that sort of thing. Sitting through 3 movies, essentially in one sitting, you were not so restless that you could get through that, huh?
I was in my 20s.
My
bladder didn't call the shots for me like it does now. I had a little money because I was working when I went to college. One of the little side stories is my friend and I would go and get Kentucky Fried Chicken every Monday, Friday night. We're working part-time going to college. And the guy who ran the Kentucky Fried Chicken place was John Wayne Gacy.
Really?
He got finally arrested for molesting one of the boys there, went to prison in Iowa, went to Illinois, and then went on his horrible, spree of killing all those young men. And I remember my friend and I, who sadly died from exposure to Agent Orange in Vietnam at a young age, we looked and said, that's that greasy fart that used to be behind the fryer at the KFC over in Logan Avenue.
Wow.
So that's apropos to nothing, but it was an interesting period. But yeah, triple features. Drive-ins would have 3, 4, 5 movies. You might be able to see all 5 Planet of the Apes films. And they'd be like second or third run, and it wasn't heard of. I mean, double features were still around in the theaters, but they were starting to fade by the 70s. But the drive-ins, man, it was an all-night affair. Get there when the sun was going down about 8 or 9, start driving home at 5 or 6 in the morning to go to work or school the next day.
Oh, my goodness.
What did you like better, Richard? Did you like the drive-in better, or did you like going to a traditional movie theater?
I like to drive in because it was more relaxing. But if I wanted people around me and get involved, particularly a comedy, it's like going to see Blazing Saddles. You have to see that in the theater where everybody's around you. But once I took my former sister-in-law and my 2 boys, my wife and I, we went to see all 3 or all 4 Bruce Lee films at the drive-in. You should hear the audience screaming and yelling and enjoying this.
Yeah.
Particularly in Richmond, because it has a large African-American population. I went to a theater regularly called the Virginia. and they show revivals. This is when they first revived Todd Browning's Freaks. They revived King Kong and other stuff. It'd be me and otherwise everybody else in the place was African American, and they love these films and they get so into it. And it's infectious.
Yeah, yeah. 1972, you are discharged from Vietnam. Let me ask you, how long were you in the war?
I didn't go to Vietnam. Every one of my friends saw combat. I never got left the country. Like all of us, we were draftees. They had when I got to Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, a hot, buggy place in June and July. They say, anybody here know how to type? Well, you do anything to avoid what they call on-the-job training, which generally meant send out those rocks. I said, yeah, I type. I went in there, and it was manual typewriters. I was the only one in the group had ever typed in a manual. That's all I had. And it was how many words you type, less your errors. And they were doing -16. Well, I pounded out 37. I became a clerk typist. What they used to call drill sergeant, a Remington Ranger. And I went to my school for this, and I said, I can't drag this out for 8 weeks. The guys are in back playing cards. I passed the typing test, 55 words a minute. How to fill out an envelope. About a half dozen of us got sent to what they call AFES stations, Armed Forces Entrance and Examining Stations. Me and the guy from some little town, we went to Richmond, Virginia. Others went to Pittsburgh. Everybody else from that group went to Vietnam. So
Really?
I sometimes feel guilty that I escaped all this. That why me, and why did my friend Mike go over there and get blown up by a mine and then go to Agent Orange? So yeah, you kind of remember it.
Well, you were still in the service. You were on a military base, so you were fulfilling your duties in that way.
Military base. Once I left, I mean, I had a job. This is ridiculous, but I lived in an apartment for the whole time. I worked 8 to 5, 5 days a week. The only time I slept on the military base to get my teeth worked on. So, I used to go to the Defense General Supply Center to their PX and to play basketball every night. So that was my service, but I'm proud of it. I do what I tell you. My dad's from World War II, and he got drafted. He didn't enlist. Got out of high school, had his draft notice in 1944.
So in 72, you're out of the military completely. You are moving on to a different interest. You come up with the idea to publish this magazine about British horror. How did that idea come to you?
Well, it was going to be a general interest zine. The first 3 are kind of in that way, but the Hammer had always hit me hard. There was something about it, the colorful sets, and Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing and the beautiful women and the stories. It was set in a fairyland period that really never existed. It wasn't like something from American International. And like I said, the first 3 covered a lot of different things. We interviewed Vincent Price. We had one of the first and only interviews, Lon Chaney Jr., and Paul Nashi, the famous Spanish star. But after I did number 3, and that was in 1974, I had graduated from college. I had been living with my parents, but I met my first wife, and we moved in together, and I figured it was done. But when I decided to come back, I said, I'm going to do something strictly about Hammer, and that took 4 years. And it was a slick magazine when it wasn't cheap to do a slick magazine. And it went from there, and I cover other British films because you can only write about the Karnstein girls or Dracula or Frankenstein so many times. We did a beautiful cover issue on Haunting, shot over there, and on Village of the Damned. So, and some that are not so good, like Blood Beast Terror. But yeah, we tried to did a complete issue on Frankenstein, the True Story.
Oh my goodness. Oh, wow. What were some of the biggest challenges that you faced during those early days of your publishing?
Be married and having children.
Oh,
And suddenly all the money I was spending on my movie soundtrack LP collection and posters and that, and they all kind of went. I used to buy books. It was always getting a hold of people. This is no emails, no internet. I get a hold of unions, and they would give me the addresses of people. So you had the snail mail going back and forth. But I had friends in England I'd made, and they'd go and do the interviews. because we interviewed people that nobody ever interviewed about Hammer films. The great Jack Asher, he was their lighting cameraman. He never wanted to talk about it because him leaving Hammer was, I think, very unpleasant experience. They basically said, you're too slow. And even though this is a guy who photographed Horror of Dracula and Curse of Frankenstein, Brides of Dracula, and all these gorgeous films, yeah, you're too slow. We can't afford you anymore. But finally, his daughters kept badgering him, and he said, okay, I give up. They convinced me of the worth of what I did. Mm-hmm. And we interviewed people like him, both actors and actresses, behind the scenes people. I look back at now, it's like 300 and some interviews, and they're almost all dead.
Oh my goodness.
But yeah, making the connections and coming up with the money was like, but it's never very expensive until these last few issues.
Mm-hmm. Oh my goodness. Making those connections would be quite difficult. I can't even imagine what it would have been like to try to establish interviews like during that period of time. I know, because you mentioned like today, it's relatively, pretty easy with the internet and emails and websites to go to, but just regular old-fashioned mail, I can't even imagine.
One of the things I'm doing right now is I'm downsizing, and I'm 77. When the last issue comes out, later she'll be 78, and it's been a good run. But I said, I've got hundreds, not thousands of books. I threw away over 3,000 VHS tapes of things I've been recording since 78. And I've kept the pre-records, but I don't know what the heck I'm going to do with them. I have a friend in town. They're doing a documentary about me in Little Shoppe of Horrors called Pages of Terror, Pages of Horror, The Legacy of Little Shoppe of Horrors. And they've interviewed a lot of people like John Carpenter, and people who are fans of the magazine. But I've been giving it to him. I said, do you want my famous monsters? You want my Castle of Frankenstein? Been easier than I thought. I think it's because you realize some point, if you don't, and my sons aren't interested, and none of my grandkids are, it's going to end up in the dumpster. And that'd be terrible.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Those are, pieces of you and collector's items, and that stuff is just history, actually. Like it's a piece of history.
The younger generation has zero interest almost in this. It's like if you were a fan of the old serial westerns in the 30s and 40s, there was a monster following. Now it's all gone. It's not been passed on. At least my boys were exposed to Hammer. My daughter-in-law loves Hammer and British horror and the classic Universal. But most people, nah.
Oh my goodness.
It's all going to go away if you don't deal with it now.
Oh, how would you, from your perspective, how would you try to gauge interest in the younger generation to try to get them interested in this kind of thing again?
Well, we have a local art house called the Varsity of Drake University in downtown Des Moines. It's been renovated. In the last 2 years, we've had a Halloween showing. 2 years ago, one night, it was like Friday night was Curse of Frankenstein. Saturday night was Horror of Dracula. Last year on the Sunday at like 1 o'clock, we had Brides of Dracula. We had really good turnouts. So I guess it's just, you put it out there. It's never, ever, ever going to be like it was before, because the people grew up with it. We're fading out. And you can put it out there. And I look at some of the great films from the 40s and 30s and 50s, and nobody really has a huge amount of interest in it anymore. But that's all right. It's like I look at the magazine covers when I go in to buy grocery stores. And I say, I don't know who any of these people are. But that's amazing. When you're wrong with them, it means I'm old. I don't know who they are. I don't watch this stuff.
Oh my gosh. I feel the same way. I have teenagers, and some of the stuff that they're into, I don't know anything about it. And even I'll go to the grocery store and see pictures and magazines and have no idea.
But it'd be like if somebody in my generation, they're putting pictures of Russ Columbo up, and they go, well, who's Russ Columbo? They were popular back in the 30s. I exposed my boys to all these when they're very young. We watched first VHS and recording stuff when a blank videotape was like $27, and a VCR was $1,000. Now it's throwaway.
Yeah, no, exactly. Oh, oh, awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Richard, let's talk about some of the people that you have met over the years. And I guess that's been one of the great benefits to doing this magazine, at least for you personally, in addition for your fans. But you've met a number of cast and crew, particularly those that have starred in Hammer films. One of them, I understand you got pretty close to, became friends with, the great director Terence Fisher. Tell us about him.
I wrote to Fisher shortly after I got out of the Army. That's when I started out. He had just in 72 done his last film, which is Frankenstein and the Monster from Hell. And he'd write me back in these flourishy and these blue paper and, back and forth. And we never talked on the phone or that, but he is the only film personage in front of, behind the camera I ever wanted to meet in person. And I got to meet him. And we met at the 1977 Horror League convention in London at the Kenilworth Hotel. I had this unbelievably awful denim jumpsuit on, but all I can say is, hey, it was 1977. Give me a break. My wife at the time, Carla, who looked and was built like Ingrid Pitt, so I was pretty lucky. In high school, I never even spoke to girls. I was terrified. Later on, one of my friends said, boy, you've had good-looking wives and girlfriends. I said, well, I guess things balanced out. But anyway, we sat and we talked in the bar. The great Michael Ripper, the character actor, often played the bartenders up the bar. And Terry looks and said, shouldn't Michael be behind the bar serving the drinks? We later went to see a 60 mil showing at the convention of Curse of the Werewolf. And he's whispering to me the whole time. Terence Fisher's telling me about Curse of the Werewolf and how Oliver Reed never done anything better. And it finished, and they started showing the Jess Franco El Conde Dracula. And he's saying, God, I wonder if this is better than my Dracula. And he kind of liked it, but Fisher would use zoom cameras or, zoom shots, but still, then, Jess Franco, his zoom, 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 zoom. He finally said, one more, we're going back to the bar. Next shot, zoom. He stood up, I stood up, went back to the bar. And we stayed up in contact to his death in 1980 because he died. Mario Bava and Alfred Hitchcock all died within like a month of each other in 1980. I did a series of 9 The Men Who Made Hammer for Shout Factory, Scream Factory, for 2020 Hammer Blu-ray releases. It was like Jimmy Sangster, Roy Ashton, Michael Carreras, Bernard Herrmann, James Bernard, Anthony Hines, Roy Skaggs. These names may or may not mean anything to you, Tracy. Jack Asher, and Terence Fisher. And basically, I had been flown to LA to do something. I did the commentary for The Lost Continent, but told me I'd never wanted to do another one because that's hard work. But after that, Constantine Nasser, who was a producer at Warner Brothers, said, we need to make use of your Hammer knowledge. You're the only one. You're the only person who knew everybody at Hammer. You're the last link to them. And I think, damn, it's kind of old. Even my wife said that. So we said, why don't you just talk about the people you knew and what you knew about them? So he plopped me down over 2 days for hours and hours, mic'd me up, and I just talked off the top of my head.
Wow.
The best thing is I didn't do, at all, because I was talking about, for better word, for people I've known and thought about my whole adult life. And the Fisher one was really close to the heart. And the Roy Ashton one was tough because he's my longest time friend. He's the guy who did the makeup for Curse of the Werewolf, Plague of the Zombies, the reptile. But towards the end, because he always wrote letters, and I got back a letter basically repeated to me what I had said in my last letter. Well, the previous Hammer makeup man was Phil Leakey. And my first wife and I had stayed with him in his Dorset home. And I called and said, there's something wrong with Roy. And I explained, said, I'll get back to you. And I get a call, and he had dementia, Alzheimer's, whatever it is. It's like his wife, Alyssa, said, he died of pneumonia. It's what the doctor called the old man's friend. But when I was talking about it, then I kind of started crying. So it brought us some memories.
For those not familiar with Roy Ashton, he was basically the equivalent to the great Jack Pierce with Universal. I mean, Ashton was phenomenal at doing makeup.
Yeah, Jack Pierce was employed by a full-on studio with offices and assistants. He was on contract, 12 months a year. Roy Ashton only got hired like a week or so before he started to film. He'd had to assume he was going to get hired and start his research without being paid. He'd come in. He might have one assistant. His makeup office was converted bog, which means a bathroom. And there's no room in there because this is Bray Studios, which is basically an old manor house down by the Thames River. And yeah, we did an issue recently that had the haunting, but also had the Evil of Frankenstein, which sort of copies the Universal square-headed Carl effect monster with the blockhead, but it leaves a lot to be desired. He had no time, no money, and he probably wasn't as good as Jack Pierce, but he was doing it all by himself. But what he did was amazing stuff, and he was such a nice man. It's like a whole lifetime of letters I have. These are the ones I'll never get rid of.
Richard, let's go back to that 1977 convention in London. That had to be quite a financial investment for you to go out there. So you got to meet one of your heroes, Mr. Fisher, Terrence Fisher. Who else did you meet during that convention?
It was right after Star Wars came on. David Prowse was there. And he was well known among the Hammer people for he was the monster in Horror of Frankenstein. He was the mute muscle man in Vampire Circus. And he was in the Monster Frankenstein, the Monster from Hell. By the way, I'm reciting all the stuff, but when I go out to pick my wife's medicine, I say, "What's her birthday?" I said, either January 9th or January 12th, 1959. But I remember all this other crap. So,
yeah.
But he was talking about Star Wars. It had just come out. And he revealed there that as Darth Vader, he was going to be Luke's father. Well, supposedly this is not supposed to have ever been revealed. And it's in the interview, and this came out in 78. But there was no internet. People buying a little Shoppe of Horrors, as a rule, weren't Star Wars fans. It only came out later. Somebody posted about it on some Star Wars site. And I said, well, I'll be damned. Because he's just talking, set the recorder down. He's talking to the audience. We're asking him questions, and he brought that up. It's the kind of stuff that got him in trouble with George Lucas. But Melissa Stribling, who played the female lead in Horror of Dracula, was there and met Fisher for the first time since 1958. And Michael Ripper was there, who was in like 30 or 40 Hammer films, going back to the early black and whites. I believe James Bernard, the great music composer, was there. And we became great friends. I went to LA in 1996. We all went out to Disneyland together and went down Splash Mountain. While the younger people are all going down these other rides to get in, he and I rolled. So we sat there and he told me about his war service because he was in the same Secret Service that Christopher Lee was. So, and I can't remember. There was a really big one in 1980. There were a lot of people there. I remember Damian Thomas had just come off doing Shogun, and he was a gorgeous looking man. So, of course, my wife and all the women there thought that was pretty great. But yeah, it was an expensive trip. I had saved the money. And my first wife liked that stuff too. And, marriages end. She just died the day after Christmas. And it was tough when she walked out on the boys in 1987, 88. But you can't hold grudges. Life goes on.
Yeah.
And we were friends at the end. And I adopted, my boys were stepsons. They were 4 and 6 when I started raising them. I just adopted them 50 years later. I didn't have the money before. And then suddenly time was passing. I said, these are my boys. I've raised them for the last half century. And it was kind of nice that my ex-wife came down for the judge's ceremony. And they were doomed. They were going to get hammered whether they liked it or not. But yeah, I did the 77 to 80 convention, had tons of Hammer people there. In 1994, Michael Carreras, he was the son of the guy who really ran Hammer, Sir James Carreras. He produced a number of the films. He directed some. He wrote them. He bought the company from his father and it went down the tubes like every British company went down the tubes. In the 70s, the Americans didn't want their product, and no matter what they did, they couldn't sell it. So he lost the company. And there was kind of a last get-together for what they called the old Hammeronians, and I got invited to it. And there was Michael Carreras, there was his other co-owner, and great Anthony Hines. You see him as producer in all the classic Hammer films. There was Kenneth Hyman, who used to run Warner Brothers 7 Arts, and he's the guy who brought She and 1 Million Years BC to them. And let's see, Brian Lawrence, who was the business manager and then owned Hammer. And there was a lot of us. And when I walked in with my friend, the late writer Dennis Miko, we were supposed to be the first ones there. And I hope I'm not talking too much.
No,
okay.
Go right on.
We were the last ones there because he got lost, so we ended up going to a pub. And this was in Jimmy Sangster, who was a writer and a producer and a director at Hammer, local pub. And we walked in, and Michael Carreras, who would die of cancer 2 weeks later, smiled and said, "There's Dick Klemensen. Never worked a day in his life because he's always writing about Hammer." And Brian Lawrence, again, who's there from the beginnings, early 40s to the end, put his arm around me and said, "You know, Dick, you're part of Hammer." So, damn. Of course, at that period, I had tried to interview an actress named Susan Farmer. If you've ever seen Dracula, Prince of Darkness, she's a cute little blonde girl. She was married to Ian McShane for a while. Well, I had sent a letter off care of her agent, and I get a collect phone call from her, and she's obviously drunk. And I said, well, we'll try and do this, but she's getting personally insulting to me. And I finally said, "I'm sorry I bothered you," and I hung up. And the next night I get another phone call collect from her. I refused to accept the call. Well, she said, "Why wouldn't you take my call?" I said, "Well, you kind of nasty to me the night before." The short story is we got to know each other very well. I went to England. I started spending time with her. 4 or 5, 6 times. I spent a week over the next year and a half. She was kind of my girlfriend. And you think, wow, Hammer girl. I mean, she was born in 42, I was 47, but unfortunately, fanboy stuff goes away pretty fast. She had a very, very rough upbringing. Her father was a drunk and died. Her mother farmed her out. Her and her brother had a terrible time. Her brother became very wealthy. He's in the House of Lords. In fact, they even talk his acceptance speech about all his sister Susie had to go through. So she wanted to get married, and I said, "Oh, I don't think so." But we stayed friends to the end. Nancy liked her, and she liked Nancy. So that was at least another partial reason to be there in 1994. And then I went there in 84 and interviewed a bunch of people. And we had what they called the Bray Days in 98 and 99, about 2006, where they'd gather all kinds of the Hammer people at Bray Studios. Well, I couldn't go in 98 because I had detached retina, but I went in 99. I got to meet the brides of Dracula, Andre Melly, and Yvonne Monlar, and all these people. And this is, damn. And my best friend, Gary Dorse, went with me. And sadly, we lost him in 2013. And so, yeah, I wish I'd known Nancy then. I would have loved to take her to these. But, you deal with the time you have. But, yeah. Got to know lots and lots of Hammer people, lots of letters. Lots of phone calls.
That's an amazing story about Susan Farmer. You get 2 collect calls. She's nasty to you. You don't take the second call, but then you end up becoming friends. I mean, that's incredible.
Yeah. Well, when I found about her life, and she'd been forced into an abortion that she didn't want, and things of that nature, I'm surprised she lived as long as she did. She was a sweet, nice, intelligent person, and we all have our crosses to bear sometimes. And that's why I can never really hold anything against my first wife. Yeah. It's what it was, and life is short.
Richard, of all the actors and actresses that you have met, and there have been many over the years, were there 1 or 2 that were especially high in your list as a personal thrill because they were like your favorite? Anybody that topped the list?
I was set to meet Peter Cushing in 94 when I went to the old Hammeronians, but he was in the last stage of his cancer and he died. And I met Christopher Lee once and shook his hands. The funny thing is, Lee would get mad about my magazine because, they said this about me, it's not true. But then I find out later he read every page of it. And then he would call people that we'd interviewed. There was a couple named Hugh and Pauline Harlow. He started out in the early mid-50s as an assistant. She worked there as a secretary and eventually became a continuity person. And I interviewed them. I'd make sure to get a copy of the magazine. And Christopher goes, I was just reading your interview in Little Shoppe of Horrors. So Michael Ripper, the great character actor, was a great one to meet. The thing is, so many of the people I met were behind the scenes, but Ralph Bates, who Hammer was sort of grooming to be their next star. He was in one of my favorites, Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde, Horror Frankenstein, Fear in the Night. Another one like that. I was more inclined to have run into a Len Harris, who was the camera operator in all the classic. I never met Jack Asher, but I met pretty much everybody else. And it's really hard. My favorite is the one I was talking to at the time. It's like, Asher, what's your favorite Hammer film? The one I'm watching at the moment.
Yeah. Did you ever meet Veronica Carlson?
Yeah, Veronica was one of my best friends. My late friend Mark Miller arranged an interview and got her to her first convention. She became a regular at the conventions. And so, we talked on the phone all the time. This story's not really out of school, I suppose. I was at a FanX convention, and Veronica would sit in the bar because she knew the guys in particular, because they're mainly men at these things. It was a real boys' club. They just loved to hear her talk, and she was wonderful stories and sweet. Well, she got a little bit tipsy, and they walked her back to her room. And she turned and says, I've never cheated on my husband. They're kind of, okay. And I never slept with Dick Klemensen. And they told me this next day, and I'm going, okay. First off, had my first wife cheated me with another man. I would never do this. But the thought that even that would pop up in front of Carl's mind was like, wow. She was she was as nice as you could imagine she would have been. Nothing was put on with her.
Yeah.
It's like Ingrid Pitt. She was so much fun. She was so wild. And she took a liking to my Nancy. She put up with me, but she liked Nancy.
Ingrid Pitt's story is incredible. She was a Holocaust survivor.
Her stories are and aren't true. Take it with a grain of salt. But they're basically true. She kind of embellished, which is not unknown, but she had a real tough time with it. It's like we did an issue on the Fearless Vampire Killers. Well, you're talking Roman Polanski, who did have sex with an underage girl. I mean, he's guilty of what he was accused. We're saying, how can we do this? Because anything that's either a picture of a topless girl from a Hammer film or that, I will run past my wife. And she said, this doesn't bother me. Okay, it's good. So we did research into it. They had agreed to a prison sentence for Polanski between his attorney, the prosecuting attorney, and the judge. And then at the last minute, the judge, they figure, because he's running for office and showing tough, he was yanked it. He was going to be sent to a hardcore, max prison. So he hops in a plane and he leaves. And they interviewed the prosecutor and said, well, what would you have done? He said, I'd have left. He'd have never survived. So it was a tough call because there's no doubt he was guilty of what he was accused of doing. But so we decided simply to cover the film, which was made in 1966, up through the end of it. But we didn't mention what happened to Sharon Tate. Everybody knows what happened to Sharon Tate. Everybody knows about Roman Polanski. We covered the movie. But it was a tough call.
Yeah. Richard, let's talk about one of the subgenres of Hammer, if you will, and that is there are many Dracula films. It started with Horror of Dracula in the late 1950s. It continued, well into the early 1970s. A number of really good films in that series. Is there one Dracula film from Hammer that really stands out as the best for you? Is it Brides of Dracula, which you mentioned earlier, or is it another movie?
Well, Brides is my favorite because it's just everything that epitomizes Hammer is there. Jack Asher never lit better. Terrence Fisher never directed better. What a cast. It's a little disjointed, like Marianne must be an idiot. She's seen all this stuff. So, oh, yeah, sure, I'll marry him. Because they cut so much out of the script. That explained things.
Mm-hmm.
My favorite, because it's the one that made me a Hammer fan, is Dracula's Risen from the Grave. But the best is Horror of Dracula. If you're going to say to someone, I want to show you a Hammer movie, show them Horror of Dracula. It's tight, hour and a half. It moves, nothing drags. You have some amazing visual scenes in that. And Cushing is incredible when he puts the coat around the little girl and holding the teddy bear, even though the teddy bear was an anachronism for that period. It works in every way that a movie can work. I think if they're going to like Hammer films, this is the one to introduce them to. I like their last two modern day films. They were the only ones they could get an American company to put money up for. That was Warner Brothers and Dracula. Because Michael Carreras had told me the Frankenstein films made just enough money to justify another and to keep Peter Cushing working. But the Dracula, the charisma of Christopher Lee, wow. And I particularly like the modern day, they keep saying, oh, they're high school kids. No, they're college kids. I don't think they should have hid Dracula off in some little church. It should have been like Count Yorga. You should have been out there kicking ass. But you got a bunch of World War II and, Depression era writers trying to write something for what they think is the modern day. And both of them are good films. Satanic Rites is good, but it was the end of the line. The Exorcist had come out. Warner Brothers had financed one of the bitter Amicus compilation film from Beyond the Grave. A really bad but fun film from Herman Cohen called Craze. And Legend of Seven Golden Vampire. Warner Brothers didn't release them in the United States. The market had changed. They didn't want to waste the money even trying to sell them. Mm-hmm. And that's really putting a stake into the coffin for Hammer Films and virtually every British company. Amicus, Tygon, Tyburn. AIP was gone by 79, the same year that Hammer went under.
Yeah.
The producer, Aida Young, was one of the female producers, and it was tough being a female there, or any place in England at that time. Said there was a time, and then there wasn't.
All the Dracula films that you mentioned, Richard, I like. One that I really like that a lot of people don't seem to like is Dracula AD 1972, which is set in current day or modern day London. You have Christopher Neame as Johnny Alucard. You have Carolyn Monroe. I like the movie. What do you think of that one?
Yeah, I think I mentioned it a little bit, but yeah, I think it's a good attempt by Hammer to upgrade. Again, I think they should have got Dracula out of the church.
Oh, okay. That's what you were referring to. I see.
I think it was actually a success, and that's why they went ahead the next year with Satanic Rites. But the Hammerheads, man, do not step out of what they expect, or they just, oh my gosh, it's terrible. It stinks. It's like Scars of Dracula, which it simply looks cheap. But there's nothing particularly wrong with it. They come out of, they used to have what they called programs in pictures. I mean, I'm going to make 5 this year for Columbia and 3 for Universal. But after the end of 1969, Seven Arts has sold out Warner Brothers. Warner Brothers said, no, it's not going to be any more programs. It'll be film by film on what we think it's going to make. And along comes a hookup with English. For James Carreras, he knew everybody, but he knew the end was coming. So he really wanted to milk the markets. And that was a company called EMI. They had bought the old Associated British Picture Corporation. And he was buddies with Sir Bernard Delfont and all those people. And so they did like 8 or 10 films. And Scars was just one of them. I saw that at the drive-in Richmond. We'd had a storm the night before, and half the tiles were blown off the drive-in screen, but by gosh, I was there. But the answer, yeah, I like AD 72. I think it's a fun film.
Yeah, I do too. I want to ask you, Richard, about 2 non-Dracula movies that I particularly like. One is from 1968 with Christopher Lee, The Devil Rides Out. Your thoughts on that?
Absolutely fantastic film. We've done 2 issues of Little Shop of Horrors that have featured it. Number 12 had a beautiful painting on the cover. I should send you a copy of it by email by Steve Karchin, one of our first artists. And not our most recent, but number 50 had a huge production making of on it. I just love it. I'm hoping that the people at the Varsity, that's the one we're bringing this Halloween. It's one that Christopher Lee always wanted to remake. And it's Terrence Fisher, which makes me wish Fisher had worked more. Terry drank, and not so much when he's working, but twice he stepped out in front of vehicles, got his leg broke. Otherwise, he used to do like 3 films a year. By then, there just weren't enough. But he would have done 1 film a year, probably to the end of Hammer. He was scheduled to do Dracula's Risen from the Grave, but he had broke his leg. But in the 67, oh man, Devil Rides Out. Everything about that film works. People complain about the effects, but it's 1967. If it wasn't Ray Harryhausen, it was all bad effects. James Bond had terrible rear projection stuff in that period.
Yeah.
But Fisher, it did not do well in the United States. None of the films Hammer made in 67 did well in the States. But it wasn't so much a reflection of the films at that 20th Century Fox was having terrible troubles. And I mean, I believe Tora lost money. Patton, I think, basically every film they made lost money, and the Hammer 6 just sort of fell into it. But Fisher would have directed that. He would have directed Dracula's Risen from the Grave. Then he did Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed. He was set to do Lust for a Vampire, which is certainly not a favorite, but it was to have Peter Cushing in it. It was another Karnstein film. The great production designer Bernard Robinson had been hired for it, and it had Fisher. Well, Cushing's wife turned very ill. He backed out.
Right.
Bernard Robinson, he got in a call. He's at his home with his wife, Margaret, who he'd met working on Brides of Dracula and The Mummy and Hound of the Baskervilles. And he hung up the phone because he was painting the doorway and said, "That's Hammer. They hired me for another film." Goes back to painting, dropped over dead. And Fisher could have done the studio work. He couldn't do any of the location work. And if you've seen Lust for a Vampire, there's a lot of location. So it's kind of a what might have been. And then Frankenstein, the Monster from Hell is his last film. That's the cover of our Little Shop 50, and that's a great little movie. Cushing, Madeline Smith, Dave Prowse. It's really terrific.
Yeah. We want to talk about your newest issue in a moment. The other film I want to get your thoughts on that I've enjoyed for many years, and sadly the star of it just died, Horst Janssen, Captain Kronos, Vampire Hunter. Your thoughts on that one?
It was a really nice trip afield for Hammer, trying to find something new that an American company. It's one of the few films that Hammer itself actually put money into and actually owns. There's a gorgeous 4K that came out of England that I was involved in. We interviewed a lot of people in Little Shop number 18 on Captain Kronos, Horst Janssen and Carolyn Monroe, and pretty much everybody involved in it. And Brian Clemens, who wrote it and directed it. And it went out with Paramount in the United States. I remember going to the theater to see it, and there was nobody there. It was just me. And the same thing happens, a couple other Hammer double features, because they all got American releases, but nobody went to them. Changing times, I guess, because this would have been, they made it in 72. It didn't come out in 74. But yeah, it's colorful and wonderful. The music score by Laura Johnson, fabulous. There's a great CD of it available. So, yeah. Unfortunately, all the great classic Hammer films, Hammer does not own the rights to, because I've been working pretty close with the new Hammer people. And the new owner is the 7th richest man in England. So he's got the money, but they're playing it close to the vest. And what will work and what won't work. It's why when the group before that did The Woman in Black, which I thought was terrific. But was it successful because it was Hammer in the film, or was it successful because of Daniel Radcliffe? And probably more Radcliffe, but still the film was great.
Yeah, that was a really good movie.
Did you see the sequel? for
I
the
did
follow-up.
not. No, I didn't see that one.
Set around the same house called The Angel of Death. And it's really, really well done. We did literally a whole, or most of an issue on Woman in Black, Little Shop 28. We interviewed Daniel Radcliffe and pretty much everybody involved in it. Our name luckily has got around that when people hear our name, oh, we'll cooperate with you. Are you familiar with the writer John Logan, screenwriter? Well, let's put it this way. He wrote Gladiator. He wrote two of the last James Bond films. He wrote us Alien film, one of the Star Wars films. Let's see, Sweeney Todd, this long list. He's worked with Martin Scorsese in that. Unfortunately, he just lost his house in the fires on California. But he did a mini series on Showtime called Penny Dreadful, which owes a lot to Hammer. But he is a huge Hammer fan and turned out a huge Little Shoppe of Horrors fan, which always freaking amazes me.
Oh, that's so cool. That is really cool.
It's fun. You got to be human. It's fun for the ego. I'm sitting in the middle of nowhere, Iowa, among the snow and the corn, and you find out these people like this stuff, and you go, "Damn, see, Nancy should have married me earlier." I know important people.
Oh my gosh. Oh, that's so cool. So when is the newest issue of your magazine coming out? Do you have a date set for that yet?
Well, my latest issue came out right the 1st of January, which is number 51.
Right.
Let's see, my mind's gone blank. Oh, the cover was the original Nosferatu. Tied it in with an article we had that Hammer was going to do a biography, a fake biography, victim of his imagination about Bram Stoker. And unfortunately, we get caught up when Diamond Comics went belly up, so I'm not going to get paid. Thank goodness I'm careful with my money. Right now, I'm only going to do 2 more issues, and I'm done. It's too much time, and I don't have the energy. It's going to be next is totally devoted to Gorgo. Have you ever seen that? 1960 giant dinosaur. They capture its baby. Mom comes looking for it. It's pretty fantastic. I saw this as a kid, and that's sort of in the works. And I work with my sister, who's my designer, has been since 1980, but she's close to my age, and she has trouble getting fired up for it too. So I work around her schedule. But the last issue, we'll have our original cover artist, which is Steve Karchin, who used to work for Time Magazine and TV Guide and all those when they had original cover art. And it'll be The Abominable Snowman, Hammer 1956. And the producer, animator, Bruce Timm, he's known basically for creating the Batman series, the Justice League. I mean, he's one of the best known artists in America. I didn't even know who he was when he wrote me a fan letter back in 1994. We'll have the back cover. He right now is producing season 2 for Prime, I believe, of Batman. But he says, oh yeah, I got to be in the last issue. But it'll be The Abominable Snowman, The Horror of Frankenstein, a non-Hammer science fiction film called The Gamma People. John Logan has written a really nice feature on the 1970 Hammer films he liked, which don't always get their due. And I've got a number of original pieces of artwork. It'll be a nice way to go out.
Oh, that sounds beautiful.
Every one of my issues, with my sister helping, has been reprinted on Kindle Direct Publishing through Amazon. And I was even able to put color in there and even offer hardcover versions of all of them, as well as paperback. So,
oh, nice.
Considering I sold out so many of them years ago, I got it back in 1974. I didn't think I'd still be doing it in 2025.
Richard, one of the really impressive things about your magazine, in addition to the in-depth articles, is the wonderful cover art that you've had over the years. How have you been able to get all these great artists to contribute and do such wonderful work? I mean, really outstanding.
Well, the first one was, again, Steve Karchin. I'd known him for fan art because someone went back to the 70s. Originally, because he did our first one, Kiss of the Vampire, which is an unbelievably gorgeous painting. And in those days, you had to take the artwork, take it to a place in New York, and they'd photograph it like they're photographing a person. And that's how they did paperback covers. Now it's all scanning.
Mm.
But he did the first 3. Then a gentleman named Jeff Preston, who is an incredible artist. In fact, he had a good career doing Christian art. And then that kind of way, now he works for the U.S. government, for the Navy, former Navy SEAL, shows you what an odd mix. And he did Curse of the Werewolf, Brides of Dracula. And again, Bruce Timm had been doing some black and white, and he said, I'd like to do a cover. So his stuff is like what was it? First one was the Karnstein trilogy, Vampire Lovers. And the word got around. They see Little Shop. I don't mess up my covers with a whole bunch of advertising crap and blurbs. We have the title, the issue number, the price, and then like, say, The Haunting. That's all that's on that. The Haunting.
Mm-hmm.
Or the other ones. And they like it, and we reproduce it fairly expensively. And the word just got around, and people who normally charge 5 figures says, yeah, I'll do it for free. Just don't tell anybody I did it for free.
Yeah.
William Stout, he's been a storyboard artist for Steven Spielberg. He's probably the #1 artist in the world on dinosaur art. Has done a couple for us, which is I'm going, wow. Yeah, William Stout. But yeah, it's just word of mouth. I treat them well. I never lose their original artwork, because I used to lend stuff to Fred Clark, the late Fred Clark of Cinefantastique, in case you do a Hammer article. If I sent him 30 photographs in those pre-scan days, he'd return 29. If I sent him 25, he'd return 24. So my goal is always don't lose anything. For God's sake, don't lose Bruce Timm's original artwork, because he probably could sell it for 20 grand.
Richard, final question before we let you go. For those who are watching or listening and would like to get the current issue or some back issues, what's the best way for them to do that?
I have them all available on my website, www.littleshopofhorrors.com. And the shop is Old English, SHOPPE. One of the reasons I took Little Shop of Horrors, I'd seen the title of the Corman, and it was in public domain, but I thought, oh no, we got to give it a little bit of a British tag to it. So we, shopped another P&E on it. But yeah, that's the best way, and it helps me. Still got bills.
Littleshopofhorrors.com. Little as you would expect, and then SHOPPE of horrors.com. And that all runs together on the URL. And that's the best way to get the current issue, number 51, just came out in January, or some of the back issues. I guess most of the back issues are available.
I either have like 8 or 9 or 10 of the original print runs. All the rest of them are done on reprints of Kindle Direct Publishing. I use their highest quality paper. Where possible, I add in color that I couldn't afford in the original print run, because we do a beautiful, slick magazine, but it's expensive to produce. And color, we do just the 4 colors. All my covers, I don't accept advertising. I give maybe a page of just free ads to my friends, but each issue I did, I thought this could be the last one. So I'm not going to sell half the magazine. Simply going to be people selling videos and stuff.
Our guest has been Richard Klemensen, founder and publisher of the wonderful magazine Little Shop of Horrors, a great journal of classic British horror films. Richard, it's been a blast. Thanks for being with us this past hour.
This worked out. Being at first, I thought, oh dear, my wife's old laptop ain't going to let me do it. So it's very nice meeting both of you.
Yeah, same here as well. I was a little worried about the power. I don't know if you guys could hear the wind in the background here. I'm surprised, the house didn't lose a few shingles in the process. I think we're intact. I'm glad we stayed on the air. Thank you very much, Richard. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Bruce. Thank you, Tracy. Very nice to meet you.
You as well.
Our guest, Richard Klemensen. Yep. Tracy, sorry I cut you off there. Thanks to Richard, to Tracy, our executive producer and co-host of the show. We thank all of our listeners as well for joining us this week in this Museum of the Macabre. And we do hope that we'll see you again next time right here in the Ghostly Gallery.